Hi, everyone. I think we're live. I am McKenna Jordan. I'm the owner of Murder by the Book Bookstore in Houston, Texas. And I could not be more excited and honestly nervous to be interviewing such legends tonight. We are joined by James Lee Burke and Stephen King. Before I get to interviewing them, I would like to say just a quick word about Independent Bookstore Day. As today is Independent Bookstore Day, and so many indies have been struggling for the past several months, I'd like to take this quick moment before introducing our stars to say a couple things. At Murder by the Book, we've spent this time adapting to virtual events, coming up with hours and hours of free digital content, and trying to unite authors and readers every day. We believe that our landmark events like tonight should be free to watch, especially in this time where so many people are facing economic hardship. But it's a trade-off. If we keep making these events free, how can we pay the rent and payroll and stay open to keep bringing more events to you? In the spirit of Independent Bookstore Day, I hope that if you enjoy the talk tonight, you'll please consider ordering books by one or both authors from us. We have signed book plates to include in all orders of the new James Lee Burke book, A Private Cathedral, and we can get any imprint title by either author for you. If you don't need a book today but want to send something our way to show your appreciation, we've dropped a link, or we will be dropping a link, in the event description as well as in the comments to our virtual tip jar. Think of it like a suggested donation at a museum. Your support helps us keep bringing a high level of content to you. And if today's not a good day to support us, we hope that you'll consider supporting us some other time or send some love to your local independent bookstore, wherever you may be. Now on to the good part. Let's bring in the stars of the show. James Lee Burke is a New York Times bestselling author, two-time winner of the Edgar Award, and the recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship for Creative Arts and Fiction. He's authored 38 novels and 2 short story collections. He lives in Missoula, Montana. Hi, Jim. How are you? I think we're muted. Hang on just a second. Let me see something real quick. We've just got to unmute you.
We're good.
Okay, there
Hello.
we go.
Okay.
Hi, Jim. Now we can hear you.
This is unmuted Jim.
Okay.
Okay.
Perfect. All right. That's our only technical glitch. I'll take it. Stephen King is the author of more than 60 books, all of them worldwide bestsellers. His recent work includes If It Bleeds, The Institute, Elevation, The Outsider, Sleeping Beauties, co-written with his son Owen, and the Bill Hodges trilogy. He is the recipient of the 2018 PEN America Literary Service Award, the 2014 National Medal of Arts, and the 2003 National Book Foundation Medal for Distinguished Contribution to American Letters. He lives in Bangor, Maine with his wife, novelist Tabitha King. Hi, Steve.
Hello, how are you?
Woo, we can hear you. Doing well. So excited to be talking with you. I have been so excited to chat with you both that I haven't been able to sleep. I have lots of questions, both my own and some submitted by fans ahead of time. But if you want to take the chat in any direction at any time, feel free to do so. So let's dive in. Jim, you're joining us from Montana, and Steve, you're in Maine, right?
Right.
Have you two ever met in person before tonight?
No, except we read each other's books, don't we, Jim?
Yes, and we've exchanged emails, of
That's
course.
correct.
And I want to, well, I don't know if Steve would remember my letter because he received many, I'm sure. At the time, my cousin was Andre Dubuse, who was in a terrible accident, had just enormous hospital bills. And Steve, among some others, did a reading to raise money for him. And I didn't know Steve, and I wrote, and neither did Andre. And he did that out of goodwill. And I wrote him a thank you letter. And that was many years ago. I don't know, over 20 years ago.
I didn't remember that you sent me that letter, but I do remember that event. Andre was a wonderful writer, and I know his son, Andre Dubus III. And Andre actually stopped to help a motorist in distress, I think, on the turnpike, and got out of his car, and a guy came along and clipped off one of his arms and one of his legs, I think. And the hospital bills, like Jim said, were enormous. And we got together in Boston. We did a reading. We missed you there, Jim. That would have been good.
Well, it was very good that you all did that.
We were talking before this started about the fact that the quality of both gentlemen is represented in their works. And I think that that story just illustrates that. So Jim, we might have a few Stephen King fans being introduced to you and your writing today. Can you tell us about your series hero, Dave Robichaux, and what's happening in Private Cathedral?
Well, Dave Robichaux is a narrator of a series of books I've written. This is the 23rd title in the series. He's a sometimes police officer. He's from New Iberia. He used to be with NOPD. He actually is not a very good police officer. He has a way of getting into lots of trouble. He's actually a figure that I borrowed from the Middle Ages and the Miracle and plays that were, as they were called. He's the egalitarian knight, except he's a blue-collar knight. He's certainly an American knight. He's not an elitist, that's for sure. But he has the characteristics that most Americans consider our own, that define the protagonist in the early American novels of James Fenimore Cooper, in courage and decency, and he tries to give voice to those who have none. But he also has the characteristics of the tragic protagonist. He's deeply flawed, and those flaws often precipitate great chaos in his life and the lives of others. But anyway, I guess what I'm saying is that I've, like most of what I write, I borrow heavily from Greek and Elizabethan tragedy.
And what's taking place in Private Cathedral?
Oh, you did ask me that. That title comes from a line in the book, and Dave Robichaux says, when people go through a certain experience that some call the long night of the soul, they earn a chapel in a cathedral. And it's a very lonely place. It's filled with stained light flowing through the glass window above his head. But it's a very lonely place to find oneself in. And anyone who has been through that experience, the long night of the soul, knows what I'm talking about. It is a combination of what a psychiatrist would call agitated depression or clinical depression. And also it tends to be augmented by what is called psychoneurotic anxiety. And you put those two together and you've got what is called a Gethsemane experience. You literally sweat blood. But after the person comes out of it, he's never the same again. And you get to, he says, there may be, he calls it the 3% club. That's what Dave says. There's probably only about 3% of the population goes through it. And they really pay their dues. And he's one of those guys.
Sounds great. So Steve, I hear you're a Robichaux fan.
Yeah, I am. And I have read or listened to all of the books. And I think that I'm a big fan of audio books. And I had read probably 4 or 5 James Lee Burke's books. And then I was going on a long trip and I picked one up, and Will Patton reads it. And, you know, to me, audio is the acid test for prose. When it's bad, you hear every clunk, every bump, everything that's not right, everything that's infelicitous. And those books just flow. And Will Patton is a genius reader. And after I heard him, when the Mercedes books came out, the trilogy about Bill Hodges, I got Will Patton to read them because, and I got to tell you, Jim, he did the best reading of Faulkner's Light in August that I think anybody could possibly do. It's just an amazing thing. And he's an amazing voice, and he's also a great actor. It's funny because Jim is in Montana, and there's a series that I watch, I think a lot of people watch. It's called Yellowstone, and it's set in Montana. And who should show up in the last 2 or 3 episodes of the current season but Will Patton playing a really bad man. So I've been listening to these books, I've been reading these books, and Dave Robichaux is a great character. The texture that Jim gives to Louisiana, to Bayou Teche, to these places is a fantastic thing. It's gritty, and you got to kind of fasten your seatbelt when you read some of this stuff because Jim tells it like it is, you know. And what really, to me, makes it shine is that Dave has a sidekick named Cleet Purcell, and Cleet says anything that comes into his mind, anything that is in his head comes out his mouth. He's extremely colorful. He's vulgar. He's nasty. He drinks all the time, pretty much the way I used to drink. No, nobody drinks like Cleet Purcell. He drives old Cadillacs, and he's just a fantastic foil for Dave Robichaux. So you've got Don Quixote and Sancho Panza in a way, except it's Sancho in a pork pie hat that I always see kind of like tilted on the side of his head. And it's flat out cool. These are cool books. And the thing is, the prose is so gorgeous and so finely wrought, but it never gets in the way of the story. The stories just roll on. And I had not made the acquaintance with Robichaux for a while. And then I got the what they call a reader's edition. I'm going on, but I'm going to stop, Jim, in a minute and give you a chance to talk. But I got a galley of A Private Cathedral. You've got one there beside you. And it's a beautiful cover. It's a nice piece of work there. But there's a foreword by Jim, and it says that this is the 3rd book in a trilogy. And I went, whoa, now wait a minute. I gotta get down with this. I gotta get behind this. So the 3 books are Robichaux, The New Iberia Blues, and A Private Cathedral. They're all out right now. A Private Cathedral's in hardcover. It's on audio. You can get an iBook, iTunes, all those things that they have. The other books are in paperback, and they're available too. And they follow the story. And I want to give everybody a chance to ask questions. But Jim, I got to tell you, you created one of the great villains in the first 2 books of that trilogy. I was just amazed. He reminded me a little bit of the bad guy in Night of the Hunter, and his name is Smiley. And Smiley is a little guy, and he wears sneakers, and he loves children. In fact, he drives a good humor truck, and at one point, he has somebody in the freezer. It's great. Do you want to talk a little bit about Smiley?
Oh, Smiley is just one of the greatest characters I've ever written about. And you're absolutely correct. He is also maybe the most popular villain in all of my work. But Smiley
I know.
has no peer. And he looks like, Dave describes him as a cuddly Truman Capote.
Right. He's always got,
Lisp.
he wears t-shirts with Mickey Mouse on them, and he's evil.
The people, you have been bad, bad, bad. He's the only villain I ever had who carried a flamethrower.
Now, I hope that everybody who's watching this will understand how much we enjoy writing this awful stuff.
You know how many people wrote in asking if I would make Smiley for president buttons to wear thousands of Smiley for president t-shirts. You know, put it on the side of the Goodyear. Blip. We got our man here.
He's great. I mean, you guys that are watching this, you got to get behind this. You know, he shows up in Robichaux, the first of the trilogy. And then, you know, when you think he's done that book, by the way, Robichaux has a 9-alarm climax. You know, there's a political thing. I don't want to go into the whole deal, but it's an incredible scene. It's a tour de force. It's a set piece. You know how sometimes you read a build up to a book and it doesn't pay off. This really pays off. And then, damn, he showed up again. And I got to tell you, Jim, I was disappointed not to find him in a private cathedral, but it's still pretty darn good.
He's hanging out somewhere, someplace. So it's always it's a mistake to count Smiley out of the action.
Well, since you mentioned what's happening in private cathedral, and we have a different villain, Jim, I think this might be your most supernatural book. And I was wondering what drew you to blurring worldly and otherworldly more so this time. And clearly, discussing with Stephen King here, we can ask him also what continually draws him to blurring what's worldly and otherworldly.
Well, you're absolutely correct. This novel is far more Gothic than any novel I've written. And it borrows, again, from late medieval history or the Florentine Renaissance. The plot involves two families from Italy who have been at war with each other for 400 years. But this figure who had been the executioner for the Inquisition in the year 1600 transports himself into New Orleans just before 9/11 occurs. And his name is Gideon Rossetti. And he is indeed the most frightening antagonist that I've written about. And the story begins with Dave Robichaux's inability to understand the cruelty that seems to accompany oftentimes what's best in human beings. It doesn't fit in his experience. He has known every kind of flawed human being, but he has seen acts of cruelty that seem to have no explanation. There's no origin that would make anyone commit the deeds that he has seen. Now, I was a newspaper reporter for a little bit, and I was a caseworker in California and knew many felons and parolees. And I've known people who I think were indeed evil, but I've come to a conclusion. Dave Robichaux comes to a conclusion, and he thinks that there's not just one gene pool, that we descend maybe from different sources. And every newspaper reporter, crime reporter certainly, every first responder, police officer, doesn't matter, who has investigated certain kinds of crimes will be the first to tell you he or she has seen things he will never talk about to anyone. This real story will never make a family newspaper. And so this is what Dave embarks upon in this book, A Private Cathedral. He's trying to find out ultimately the source of evil. And then he is confronted by this executioner from the year 1600. And that's what the book's about.
And Steve, you've obviously built a career bringing in worldly versus otherworldly. What continues to, even your what would seem more straightforward detective fiction has some elements. What continues to fascinate you with that?
Well, you know, when I was probably 10 years old, there was one of the first serial killers. His name was Charles Starkweather. And he cut a trail of blood across Nebraska and Wyoming before he was caught. Bruce Springsteen wrote a song about him, where at the end, in that song, Charles Starkweather says, "I guess it's just a meanness in this world." And I had a scrapbook that I kept of clippings about Charles Starkweather. I was 10 years old. Wow. And my mother looked at it and she was kind of like, "Are you okay?" You know, the way that a mom does. She didn't want to say, you know, "Are you whacked out, going to be a serial killer? Is this it?" And what I tried to explain, I didn't have the words for it then. And I think what Jim has grappled with in this book and with other books in a very noble way is you look at the face of somebody like Charlie Starkweather and you try to understand what evil is and where it comes from. And is it on the inside? Is it on the outside? Is it something that's like in the new book, If It Bleeds, there's a private detective named Holly Gibney, and she has a young associate whose name is Jerome, and Jerome is out looking for a kidnapped golden retriever, and the ransom isn't paid, and the dog is left to die in a ditch. It's been disemboweled, and Jerome cries about it, and I would cry about it too. Anybody would. And then he says, and this is sort of what I believe, that evil is it's a bird. It's a big black bird, carrion bird, and it flies into somebody's head. And then when the evil work is done, it flies out again, and whoever did it is left to take the hit. But I don't understand it any more than Jim does. And in a way, when I write stories about the supernatural, again, to me, the idea is very comforting that evil can be like a lightning strike, that it can come from outside, that there really are ghosts that can wander the earth, that there might be monsters that are not human monsters. That's to me, that's comforting. That's the basis of fairy tales, and it makes a really good story. And I have been, obviously, I've been taken all my life with detective fiction and suspense fiction. And so I've written some of that as well, but that interest in the supernatural. The first book in the Mr. Mercedes trilogy is a straight detective story. And then it starts to wander away into other territory, more supernatural territory, until it gets to The Outsider, which is also about Holly Gibney. And then you're dealing with monsters, creatures from beyond. And the same thing is true with the story If It Bleeds. So I'm just attracted to it. You know, it's a little bit like what the cartoon Vamp Rabbit says in Who Killed Roger Rabbit. She says, "I'm just drawn that way." So I enjoy stories of supernatural and monsters and that sort of thing. And the idea is to try to make them as realistic as possible.
You know, it's funny. I was listening. I just took a quick road trip between when I was asked to interview you and today, and I listened to If It Bleeds. And it's funny, you mentioned Will Patton. I was going to ask you about that later, but I've listened to Jim's books narrated by Will for so long that I started listening to you and thought, this sounds like a Dave Robichaux book.
Yeah.
But anyway, I was listening to If It Bleeds and kept thinking, man, he's just really staying on course with this straight detective novel. And then, nope, there it came. So it was fantastic. My personal favorite story was Life of Chuck. I absolutely adored it in this collection. But it's funny because I was going to ask how much involvement you had and if you chose Will Patton, and it sounds like you chose him after listening to Jim's books.
That's exactly right.
Wow.
And you know, I'll tell you one thing. He's in this show Yellowstone, and he plays a fairly bad guy, a guy who's out of prison after having murdered his wife, and his son comes to see him. The son was put out for adoption and finds out through the machinations of the plot that this man is his father, the man that's played by Will Patton, and he goes to him. And he says, why did you kill her? And he says, son, I came home and found her giving her body to strangers. And I thought to myself when I heard that, it could be a line from James Lee Burke.
Yep. All right. So I love this question. We actually solicited questions from fans in advance. And if you submitted a question that I use, I will certainly acknowledge you at the end. But I love this question. And why don't we throw it to Jim first? Do you dream about your characters?
Yes. Do I dream about them? Yes.
Yeah. Okay. How about you, Steve?
I've had dreams when I've come to a situation where I don't know what's going to come next. But have I actually dreamed about the characters? I can't remember that I have. But it leads me to a question I wanted to ask you, Jim. I read something that you had said about how you don't really plan ahead, that you don't work from an outline, do you?
No, that's a compliment. No, no, chaos is my whole style.
Yeah. Well, I can relate to that because it's mine too. Mine too.
So neither of you outline.
No, my idea is I have sort of an idea of where I'm going. Do you have sort of an idea, Jim, of where you'll come out?
No, I never have. Now, I'm always reminded of something Ernest Hemingway once said. He was asked that question, and he said, if I knew the ending of the story, so would the reader.
Right.
Great
I
line.
think that's very smart. I think that's very smart. You know, one of the things that John Irving says that I've never understood is he said, the first thing that I do is write the last line of the book. And I thought to myself, why bother? I mean, you know how it's going to turn out. But you're right, Jim. If you knew what was going to happen, the reader would know.
Somebody, I forget who it was, told me about writing. He said, writing a story or telling a good story is like pitching a baseball. The pitcher never lets the batter see where his fingers are on the ball. He always hides the ball behind his thigh before the run. He never telegraphs, or a boxer never telegraphs his moves or his punch. But this is my own feeling. I maybe my first novel, Half of Paradise, I had some things in mind going into the novel, but thereafter I have not, and I've been doing it many years. I feel the story is already written. William Faulkner said, yes. And when Faulkner, just before his death, he said, had I not written the books, another hand would have written them for me. And I think I understand that, but I've never gotten up without being able to write. I always saw the next two scenes, and it's been that way since I was 19 years old. I published my first story in a college magazine when I was 19. But the process for me has never changed.
Yeah. Well, I usually start, I have a situation, and or sometimes there's a scene that I really want to write. And I have to have something else. I've got to have some kind of a transmission to hook it up. The situation is one thing, and then something will connect with me, and I can sit down and I can start to write. But I don't. I don't have a an outline or anything like that. I'll show you what I have. Hold on a second. Uh, what I've got is a list of characters so that I will not misspell their names or make a mistake, you know, in terms of the wrong name or something like that. Or sometimes I'll write down a few little details, but that's not in advance. That's after that character has already introduced themselves.
So a little cheat sheet just to keep things straight, and then the rest is in your head.
Yeah.
Do you have a cheat sheet, Jim, or is it all in your head?
Well, I keep notebooks. I by on my bed at night, and I wake almost every night at about 4:20 a.m. and I write things down, and they're surprisingly good. I look at them again in the morning, but I subscribe to Freud's theory that neurosis allows a conduit into the unconscious. I think he phrased it something like that. By the way, Freud had absolute contempt for novelists. Did you ever read his essay on the novelist? Jeez. If you want an inferiority complex, just read that and you'll never recover. But but he was basically a Victorian, and he had contempt for anything that was not utilitarian. But I don't know that. Geez, but he wasn't very nice. I know when I.
Well, he had some problems, didn't he? I mean, he had some personal problems,
Yes,
substance abuse and all that. So,
but anyway,
but there's a lot of truth to the idea that I think a person's subconscious is working all the time. You know, I wrote a novel called It, and at some point in the course of it, it's a very long book, and I was working away. I was a younger man then, and I had a character who went to a home for the criminally insane, and I needed a name for this place, and so I called it Juniper Hill. As far as I was concerned, I made that up. And then years later, I happened to see a movie on Turner Classic Movies that scared the living hell out of me when I was a kid. It was called The Snake Pit with Olivia de Havilland. And damn, the mental institution that they tossed her into was called Juniper Hill. And I must have seen the movie when I was 5 or 6 years old on a TV movie, but it must have stuck somewhere in the bottom of my mind. So yeah, I'm a big fan of the subconscious. I don't know exactly what it is, and I think Freud might have overstated it, but it's a very useful thing.
Are you there, Jim? Okay, yeah, we can
yes,
hear you.
I am. We were going. Go ahead.
I wasn't sure if you were going to say something, but speaking of the subconscious and where things come from, we always have the same question. Everyone wants to know. I think it's a little bit of pulling back at the curtain and seeing how the magic happens. When you're writing, what does your daily schedule look like? And why don't we start with you, Jim?
Well, I start early in the morning. Those are the best hours for me. I aim at 750 words, so that's what I've done most of my life. If I can get 750 words, I think that's really good. The next morning, I rewrite those, and then I start aiming at another 750. But I do it all the time. I do it till about 11 o'clock at night. And I work 7 days a week, and I take no days off for any reason. And if I do that, in 1 year I can produce a book, but I I have to work every day to do it. Uh, I learned after I wrote a book called The Lost Get Back Boogie that I was a better rewriter in some ways than I was a writer. But maybe I don't think about it a whole lot anymore.
Now you're on the farm or on the ranch, and you spend a lot of time outside and with horses. Do you kind of use that time as creative thinking for the book? Like, are you always thinking about it?
Oh yeah, I think it's an obsession. It never leaves me. Carl Jung, the Austrian psychoanalyst, believed in genetic memory, and that's what I actually subscribe to. I believe the great stories are all in the unconscious, and they're in the unconscious of everyone, or at least all people of goodwill. It's a matter of using them. But all the symbols that Freud talks about have their origin in the nomenclature of his science, by the way, in Greek mythology. It's the golden age of Pericles, to which we all go back. There is no story written any place on this planet that does not have its antecedent in the age of Pericles. The Bible, same way. And the symbols are all water, fertility, and hair. And this is what makes the human being such an intriguing study. Hemingway, again, he said, writing is the hardest thing in the world because first you have to learn the craft, and then you have to learn the subject, the nature of man.
Steve, what does your day look like?
I'm like Jim. I work every day. I would say that actual time sitting in front of this machine where I am now, which is my workspace, would be probably 28 hours a week. Now that looks pretty good compared to a guy who's out working on an oil rig, what Jim calls a monkey board back in the old days, you know. So that part's good. That part's good. I sit down usually maybe 8 o'clock, take the dogs out for a walk, try to get a little breakfast, do a few little things, and then sit down. Still look forward to it. Still look forward to that losing myself in other lives. That's a good thing. It's a good thing to sort of submerge yourself in another life. I think it's harder for me now than it used to be. I don't get as many words a day, but I could work from 8 until about noon, and then push back, have some lunch, do whatever needs to get done. Every now and then I'll take a day off, not very often, but it isn't just the time that you sit in front of the machine, because there's other things that go on. There are times when I haven't been able to sleep because something is not working, something is not right, and it has to be right. I've been known to get up in the middle of the night and say, I have to look at this and see. It feels like, what is it? Pilgrim's Progress, the straight way was lost. And I have to find that again. Those are times when I earn the money, when I really earn the money, and it feels like a fair trade. And then there's just times when I'll be driving along or I'll be walking out in the country, and my mind just kind of turns naturally to something that I'm doing. And sometimes I can remember when I solved the ending of a book, throwing Frisbees for the dog to catch, and it just came to me, boom. And I mean, that's the best part of the job, man. That's the best part. Uh, and you can't believe they pay you to do that.
So when you have that challenge, when you're up at night and something's wrong, is it usually a matter of backtracking or something a character did isn't true to that character? How does that generally get resolved?
Well, sometimes, you know, you just screwed up. Have you been there, Jim?
Well, yes, and it's funny, it seems like there's an autocorrect in the unconscious because it will be late at night. I mean, Pearl and I watch the classic Turner movies every night, and it'll hit me at 11:30 or just before midnight, and I'll have to go make a change in the manuscript. So
Yeah.
it's like, this is what I feel, that talent is a gift, and it comes from some place outside the artist. And it's not that I saw it, but I always wanted to be a writer. And my cousin, Andre Dubus, who was 4 months older than I, was the same way. And that's all we ever wanted to do. I just cannot imagine doing anything else. And maybe that's what a real loser is. Some guy's got a skill that by accident was given him. Did you ever see the movie Amadeus, the story of Mozart? Here's this clod who is given this enormous gift, and it drives his competitor Salieri out of his mind. It's one of the funniest movies ever made. Do you remember the scene when Salieri has written a sonata? He's so proud of it, and he goes to a party with all the Austrian royalty there. Everybody's having a big time, and Salieri says to Amadeus, "You are the first person to see my new composition. Will you play it for me?" And Amadeus says, "Certainly." And he props the sheet music up on the piano and then takes off his shoes and plays it with his toes.
Yeah. You wonder why you were able to do it, or it's kind of like being a, what do they used to call them? It's probably not a very politically correct term. Idiot savant.
That's it. You got
and
it.
Sometimes I feel like that.
That's it.
Look, hey, listen, I can't find things in the refrigerator. Okay, I have male refrigerator blindness. I do, and it drives my wife crazy. Sometimes she has to tell me, like tonight, okay, we're getting ready to do this thing, and I got on a blue sweatshirt, you know, that I'm perfectly happy with. She says it's dirty. Well, I can't see that it's dirty, but I guess it was dirty, so I changed it for something that was out of the drawer. But I can write stories. And one thing that I try to remind myself of is that it's nice to have a gift, but I'm still a human being, and I still have to behave myself and act like a decent person. There's a lot of that decency in Jim's books.
Oh, thank you.
I relate to that.
Thank you.
So this is for both of you. But I think that particularly with the latest book for Jim, there's a lot of contemporary relevance and kind of political issues in this book. How much does the state of the world and politics affect your style, tone, and subject matter? And as your perspectives change, do those new perspectives find their ways into your books?
Oh, politics is never there, I think, in a didactic way. But what we call politics is just collective human behavior. And so for a naturalist, and I was heavily influenced by the naturalist, there's no way to avoid it. The person who avoids the external world is creating an escapist medium, but it's usually not art. The most political writer in the history of the West Occidental world was William Shakespeare. And that's what made his work so great. But it went through a filter, and Henry V, one of the greatest soliloquies in the history of theater, was written. Remember, when Henry V says, "Let this be your greatest hour," sort of thing. Well, he was really a horrible person who murdered all the French prisoners who had surrendered. But the point is that to ignore particularly the drama that is taking place around us today would be an omission that would be very close to serious theological offense. If an artist will not raise his voice today, God help him and the rest of us.
Steve?
Well, there's a story in the Bible, I think it's in Genesis, where the elder brother Esau sells his birthright to his brother Jacob for a mess of pottage. And a writer that I revered, who's gone on now, Robert Bloch, changed that and said, I would never sell my birthright for a plot of message. And I try to concentrate on the story. Like Jim, I realized that books don't exist in a vacuum. They don't exist in a historical vacuum. I mean, one of the things that Jim writes about so well in all of his books is what Faulkner talked about when he said, the past isn't gone, it's not even the past. And so you have the historical, you have the cultural, and you have the political, and you have to exist in that world so that a character in one of my books might have a bumper sticker on the back that says, or wear a hat that says, "Make America Great Again." And that's not my effort to say something about that character. It's just to say, this is where this is at that time. And there's a character in, or there's a moment in The Outsider where they're in South Texas, and they go by a billboard that has Trump on it, and Trump's been given a little Hitler mustache and a Hitler forelock. And one of the characters thinks, gee, that's strange in a really red state. And then he remembers that there's a huge population of Hispanic people in that particular area, and maybe they have no great love. But it's just, it's not for me to go on and politicize things. I don't really want to do that in my fiction. I have Twitter, and I can say things about politics all I want on Twitter. But in the fiction, I want to keep the story in front all the time as much as I can. But it's part of it. And one of the things that's interesting to me is you now have the coronavirus, the reason that we're on Zoom instead of doing this in person. And I would love to be with you in person, Jim, and shake your hand. But it's not possible because of this. And I'm curious to know what kind of fiction is going to come out of this year. I really am, because that's also part of the mix.
Well, I have that as a question later on to wonder, you know, as I mentioned, Life of Chuck, already before you know what the plot device in that is, it opens with, like, you know, end times, pandemic, and terrible things happening throughout the world. And I was listening to it recently, and I thought, oh, this is a little on the nose for right now. So obviously, dystopian and post-apocalyptic fiction is always present within genre fiction horror, but it will be interesting. Do either one of you see yourselves planning to incorporate it or planning to actively avoid this time in your future books?
Go ahead, Steve.
Well, I can tell you this. I finished a novel, and I say finished, but Jim knows the deal. The novel is never finished until it's actually in the bookstores. You know, it's an ongoing process. But the book is 95% finished. It's got to have some editorial work and one thing and another. I love when a book is finished, for me, it's like having a field of snow that nobody's tracked on it. Nobody's pissed in it. You know, it's just there. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful thing. And then it goes out into the world. But this particular book was supposed to be set in the year 2020. And at one point, these characters that are not major characters, but I needed them to go away because I wanted my main character to have this particular apartment house to himself. And so I sent these people on a cruise. Well, nobody's going on a cruise in the summer of 2020. They're just not doing it. So I decided to take the whole book and set it back in 2019, which is a temporary fix. But I don't know, Jim, are you working now? Are you working on a book?
I just finished one. It's a sequel to a novel titled The Jealous Kind. And it's one of the holiday Holland storybooks. And or a continuing story that I think actually I feel that some of my best work is the historical pieces that I've written having to do with the settlement of the Western frontier. But in answer to the question, the last three books, this trilogy, were meant to be a reflection of the times in which we find ourselves. And I've always, for many years, believed there was a figure waiting in the wings. And he's been there since the 1830s when the nativist movement began. And I believe that's where we are now. And it's, I think, there's some very troubling omens. And I remember something that John Steinbeck said in The Grapes of Wrath. He said, a man does not shape history. History reaches out and looks for someone emblematic, for something that is already aborting. And maybe it's because of where I grew up. I have always believed there was a bad seed somewhere in our history and that one day we were going to see it manifest itself. And I wrote about that in that foreword that you just mentioned earlier, Steve, that it was in 1948 and anyway, I didn't mean to get into all that, but there's another side of American history that it's something that's raw and there are things I've seen with my own eyes, that I've heard with my own ears, that I never talk about. And it's in the place where I grew up. And I have seen people who carry guns and are given authority over others at least say things. If I didn't see them do the deed, there was no question about these are things I never talk about. I've written about them in the books, but I never talk about them because just like Dave Robichaux, I've heard and seen men that make me absolutely shudder, and they were not wearing chains on their ankles. They were not. They were working for Whitey. That's a fact. There's an expression down south. We all pick white man's cotton. That means the guy up there in the plantation with his feet on the veranda sipping a mint julep is a guy who's been there a long time. Mm-hmm.
So because this new book is, I assume it's historical if it's the sequel to Jealous Kind, you didn't have to deal with a pandemic in that one.
No, it's set in 1962. It's titled The Pillars of Heaven. And it's about migrant farm workers and the founding of the American Farm Workers Union. And it has to do with the massacre at Ludlow, Colorado in 1915. But the story takes place in 1962, and it's a whammeroo. It's a hydrogen bomb.
Excellent. I can't wait to read it or listen to Will Patton talk about it, whichever one comes first. I do have a quick question for you, Jim, since I think we have some new readers out there. If people want to try a Dave Robichaux book, would you recommend Neon Rain, or would you have them dive in with Robichaux?
Well, the person would have to, look, this is what other people say. A Private Cathedral is the best Robichaux novel I've read. Everyone who's read it in the trade, I mean, and my publisher, Simon & Schuster, says that. I would agree. It's, I have to say, my best work in the series, in the Robichaux series.
And as I mentioned earlier, we do have, let's see if it'll pick it up, signed book plates for anyone who wants to order a copy of Private Cathedral. I'm sorry, Steve, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say that all of the books that James Lee Burke has written are of uniformly high quality. He's been blessed with an enormous gift, not just of language, but of narrative, the ability to tell a story as narrative. But of all those books, the one that I go back to is called Tin Roof Blowdown. And it's about Katrina. And it is just, to my mind, you know, it should have won a Nobel Prize, or it should have won a National Book Award anyway, because it's an amazing piece of work. And that's not to take away from A Private Cathedral, Robichaux, Neon, anything, any of the books, the Hackberry books, the Hackberry Holland books, they're all fine. I just have a particular spot in my heart for that particular Tin Roof Blowdown, the way that I have a spot in my heart for Smiley.
Oh, thanks, Steve. That's a great honor. One of the greatest compliments I've ever received.
So speaking of favorite books, you have both written dozens of books. So putting aside your first book that launched your careers, what is the book that matters the most to you? And is there a book that you're happy to forget?
Well, I wouldn't forget any of them. I like to think that, well, I probably would have. I'd like to think that if I was back in the days before Christ was crucified, that I wouldn't have denied him 3 times. And I'm certainly not going to deny any of my books. But there are ones that I love, particularly this one called Lisey's Story that I care about a lot. And but they're all my kids, you know, and I love them a lot.
Do you have a favorite? Do you have a favorite?
Me?
Mm-hmm. Lisey's Story?
I would say Lisey's Story, yeah.
Okay. How about you, Jim?
I think Steve's metaphor is just great. They are like your children and you love them all. What I feel is the most encompassing book historically and philosophically is The House of the Rising Sun, which deals with, again, late 19th century, the Holland family, but also World War I. It deals with the Persians' journey down into Mexico in 1916. Pancho Villa, what's his name? The Sundance Kid is in it.
Sundance.
Everybody is in it. Harvey Logan is in it, who is a really bad guy. It is a whammeroo of a book, I have to say. Everything I ever thought, did, and loved is in that book. Here's the irony. In 20 books in a row that made the New York Times list, this is the only one that didn't.
Well, moving on from that, which clearly as people don't have the best taste, both of you have written lots of short stories and novellas. As a teenager, I could not stop reading Skeleton Crew, which dates me, but loved those short stories. And Jim, I'm a huge fan of The Convict. I think it's fantastic. A lot of authors find short fiction to be much more challenging than novels. Do you agree with that? And when you set out to write short fiction, how do you approach that differently?
Are you speaking to me?
Either one of you, you're welcome to answer.
Well, I always admire people who can write good short stories. It's like writing a screenplay. I messed around with it a little bit. It's like trying to get an elephant in a telephone booth or to play a guitar with handcuffs on. So I've written a number of them, but I'd much rather write a novel.
Steve?
Well, there was a time early in my career when I was a very young man, and I was working in a industrial laundry, and I was married. I had a couple of kids, and they would get ear infections, and my wife would come to me and say, "Quick, Steve, think of a monster," because I was selling some short stories to the men's magazines, the kinds that when you held them up and turned them sideways, you know, a centerfold girl fell out. And so I wrote a fair amount of short stories, and I was in a groove and I knew how to do it. I've lost some of that knack as the time goes by. It's funny how that works. I can still do it. And every now and then I do, but there have been less and less short stories as time goes by, and they have a tendency to sprawl a little bit more. And what helps me is to go back to some of the great short story writers. The two that I really revere is, I love the short fiction of Flannery O'Connor. I think that she's a fantastic short story writer. Shirley Jackson was another great one. And who is the, Jim, help me out with this, the guy who wrote, Will You Please Be Quiet, Please? He died young, short story writer.
Yeah, yeah, my head went blank.
Big drunk guy.
Yeah.
Drank himself to death pretty much.
Yeah, but I can't remember his name.
Come on, you guys. You guys
I'm no help. I'm no help. I'm sorry. I don't know this one. What was the, what is it?
Will You Please Be Quiet, Please?
All right, I'm going to pull out Google.
What We Talk About When We Talk About Love, I think was another book. I can remember the names of the books. His name is just, you know, I feel like you, Jim.
Raymond Carver.
Raymond Carver. Yeah, they're great stories. Great stories. So,
Okay.
You read those and you go back, and then sometimes you kind of refresh yourself on how you can do it. But I'm like Jim, I'd rather write a novel.
Fair enough. Okay, so you can tell from your writing, as well as just kind of knowing about you guys, that music plays a role in both your lives. I mean, you're part of Rock Bottom Remainders, and Jim had some nice cameos in his 40th book celebration video from some musicians as well. When you were writing, do you listen to anything in the background? And if not, what do you listen to for pleasure?
I don't listen to music when I'm writing anymore. I used to, and I think that my brains have gotten a little bit more, it's very hard for me to listen and write at the same time, or it's more of a distraction than it used to be. I sometimes still will listen to music when I'm rewriting, but I don't listen to it when I'm working anymore. But when I'm in the car or when I'm just hanging out, I've got it on all the time. And, you know, I'm a big rock and roll guy. So, and I play a lot of folk music. I got guitars. I don't play very well, but I entertain myself. And I know that you play, Jim, and you play a hell of a lot better than I do. I can tell you that, buddy.
Well, that's very kind. That's very kind. Yeah, but I love music. I think all artists do. Doesn't matter the medium. And I subscribe to the music of the spheres. I believe the music is up there. It's certainly in the English language. And every good writer, and I mean a good writer, has that respect for the English language because of the iambic foot. This is the one language in the world where every other syllable is accented. In other words, to compose a Petrarchan sonnet is really, it's shouldn't have been, the gift shouldn't have been given to the Italians. It should have been given to the Americans. But I love music, rock and roll, country music. I knew many people in the business. This is the best funny joke about country musicians, at least I've ever, but it's a true story. You remember little Jimmy Dickens?
Mhm.
He was recording with his band in a studio in Nashville, and there was a Times reporter there, Time magazine reporter there, who said, well, Mr. Dickens, boy, you have some very fine musicians there. Do many of them read music? And little Jimmy said, no smile on his face, yes, sir. Couple of them reads it, but it don't hurt their playing none.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I know a story about Chet Atkins. He was at he was doing a gig, and he was a great guitarist and everything, and he fell out of tune. His instrument fell out of tune, and he was tuning it, and the audience was waiting for another song and all this, and he said, by the time I found out I was no good at this part of it, I was too rich to quit.
Pretty funny.
We could, Jim, we could tell a lot of musician jokes, but we better not.
Yeah.
Well, I am a classically trained violinist, so I know a lot of musician jokes, but mine are always about the violists.
Tell us one.
Oh my gosh, not on the spot. I'll come back to you in just a minute. I'll close with a viola joke. So moving on past that, both of you have children who are professional authors, which is not very common. Can you talk about the role of books in your household? Obviously, you both have a tremendous work ethic with writing, but did you expect them to be writers and authors? And when you gather, do you all just talk about writing or not so much?
Go ahead, Jim. I want to hear your take on that.
Well, all of our children have been talented. And of course, our youngest child, Alifair Burke, has created quite a career, and she created her own career. But this is a fact, and this sounds like her father bragging, but Alifair could read the novel out loud, Cool Hand Luke, when she was 5 years old. She
Wow.
was writing her first short story when she was 7. Her IQ cannot be measured. That's a fact. The man who tried to measure it told me only 2 in a million have her IQ, but it's not measurable. And I've told this story to other people over and over again. I'm not making this up. There's a silence, and then the person says, your wife must be so smart. Or Asians are so smart. I've never had to seek humility. It's always found me. But you know what Michael Conley did to me at BoucherCon in Vegas? It's a huge audience there. And he was going to introduce me. So I said, Michael, yeah. No, I asked him, I said, Michael, will you introduce me? Yeah, okay. He grabs the mic and the place settles down. There's like 2,000 people there. And he says, ladies and gentlemen, it's just a great honor here tonight for me to introduce a man who has done one of the greatest favors that anyone could do for our kind of writing and crime and mystery, and for the gala kinds of celebrations we're doing here today. And I will introduce you now to the father of Alifair Burke, Jim Burke. And I had been a noun and I became an adverb. Michael, I'm going to name a villain out of you. But Alifair is very talented. She works very hard.
She does. How about you, Steve? Got a family of writers.
Yeah. My wife is a novelist, poet novelist. genealogist. She's like a utility player. She goes to all fields, does a lot of stuff. And I pretty much stuck to novel writing, and we had 3 kids. Our oldest is a Unitarian minister, and who does a number of other things. She's very good with the pen. And the 2 boys became novelists. Now um, we never told them, even suggested to them uh, that they follow the family trade. We were never that way. I mean, I don't have very much respect for parents who say, you must be the next generation of the people who run the business. You know, that was never the thing. We always had books in the house. In the old days, there was a lot of stuff that I couldn't get on audio to listen to. So I paid my kids slave wages to record books on tape for me, which they did. And, you know, they started to write, and of course they would show the stuff to us, and we would say, well, this is good, this is not so good. And we never expected either one of the boys to make a career of it. And this thing happens with talent, inherited talent, talent that's been refined, and it's a mystery to me. You know, there's a story that someone told on one of these shows about folk music about Bob Dylan, and this guy said, you know, back at that time, 67, 66, there were a lot of players in Greenwich Village. There were a lot of folk players in Greenwich Village. And Bob Dylan was just another guitar player who was trying to, you know, get on stage at the, you know, at the Hungry Eye or something. And then he went on a bus trip to Minnesota to see Woody Guthrie. And when he came back, he was Bob Dylan. It had changed. I mean, a switch tripped. And that was the way that it was with my boys. They went from being people who were learning their craft to people who could do it. And it was wonderful to watch that happen. And I take great pride. I've got a plaque somewhere that's one of my proudest things. Owen and I wrote a book called Sleeping Beauties, and it was on the New York Times bestselling list. And at the same time, my son Joe had a book of short stories called Strange Weather, and that was on the bestseller list. So I was on the bestselling list with both of my boys, and that was a good moment for me.
Of course, I do have a viola joke. What do you call someone who hangs out with other musicians? A violist.
Okay.
I know. So speaking of reading and the love of reading in your household, what have you each read recently and loved? And who are some of your don't miss a single book by them authors? Jim, why don't we start with you?
Boy, I'm trying to think. Lordy, gee whiz. I read quite a bit of historical material, and what is the name of the book about the Comanche nation and the Comanche Empire? And it has this moon and summer in it. It's just one of the best books on the American West I've ever read, but it's not simply a study about the Indians and then the pioneers who then eventually absorbed their lands, but it's about a descent into moral insanity on an enormous level. And I've never read a book that showed that side of American history, the ferocity of the plains on both sides. It's a frightening book, and it's so frightening I can't remember the title. I think that's the last book I read completely.
How about you, Steve?
I never miss a Connolly. I enjoy Michael Connolly very much. He's a grab it and go kind of guy. I love John Sanford, and he's a favorite of mine. I've got a shelf of his books. There's this guy named James Lee Burke who writes about New Orleans. He's a never miss kind of guy. Man, I like to read. When you say what's the last really great book that I read, I would have to say I finally caught up with a Southern novel called Bastard Out of Carolina by Dorothy Allison. And that book blew me away. I couldn't stop reading it, and it was fantastic. And I thought to myself, well, this is going to be a tough read because I know there's a certain amount of child abuse that goes on, and it's going to be tough. But it was terrific. It was just terrific book, terrific voice, and carried me along. That's what I want from a book. I want to be carried.
I will say that I've been a member of the crime fiction community for a really long time now, and there is no greater honor for these young authors than when you read one of their books and you put it out on Twitter that you read and loved it. I mean, the gratitude for you continuing to help build other authors up is out there, and I see it every day, and you doing that and being so supportive is really appreciated, especially to those new voices.
Well, thank you.
So we have just a few quick fire questions that are actually for either of you, not for both of you. So these are from previously submitted, but I thought some of these were good. So Jim, while Dave is a fascinating character in his own right, so is Hack Holland. Would a crossover of the two characters ever be a possibility?
Well, it's a possibility, I suspect, but I've never, I don't know. I never planned the books, and so I just couldn't say. It's a very honest question, but I think the worlds of the two men and all the Hollands and the Robichaux, they represent two different cultures. And look, Cleet Purcell puts it this way: Louisiana is not a state; it's a piece of Guatemala that floated on the out of the Caribbean and adhered to the southern rim of the United States. Louisiana is like San Francisco. When you're there, you know there's no other place like it. You know, but anyway, I'm sorry, that doesn't answer the question, but I've never thought about conflating the material.
Fair enough. All right, Steve, this one's for you. Are you going to write a story featuring Molly, AKA the Thing of Evil?
No, that's too terrible. That's too terrible. I couldn't possibly do that. You know, you were talking about those new novelists, new mystery novelists, people who are brand new. There's a book, a fantastic novelist called Blacktop Wasteland.
By S.A. Cosby, yeah.
S.A. Cosby, yeah, that's a good one. That's a good one. I think that people should read If It Bleeds, and they should read A Private Cathedral, but when they get through those, they'll be ready for Blacktop Wasteland.
Well, I know Sean will be very happy to hear that you shouted that out. He's a friend, and we've done a couple events with him recently, and we have signed book plates for Blacktop Wasteland. If any of you want to give it a try, it is excellent. Okay, let's see. Jim, this one's back to you. Steve has written 2 inspirational books about writing. Have you considered writing a book on the subject of writing and the craft?
No, I never have, and it's complimentary that someone would invite me to do that. But I've written nonfiction, some newspaper things and essays for magazines. But I really don't know how you write. I never have. I believe that if you can formulate, or if I could formulate the way I write, it might go away from me. I've always never I've never felt much confidence in dealing with the gift. This is one thing I learned. I learned it early, and because in my craft, and Tennessee Williams had an enormous influence on my work. I still think he was cheated out of the Nobel Prize. He was such a great playwright, but I believe that the gift is there, and it's something you put your hand in like a flame or a baptismal fount. And that's what you do with it. And I've never thought about it any other way. And I've often felt that it should have been given to someone else. And I've never felt that there's anything logical or reasonable about it. And so I'm not really talking about writing anymore. I like what Steve said a minute ago about what is it, the idiot savant. That's it. This is okay. This is the only thing I would ever tell another person about learning to write. You learn to be a good listener. You listen on wherever you are. The story is out there. It's like that music for the spheres, but you have to listen for it. And that's the only way I've ever written. Anyway, I didn't mean to run on.
You're great. We're here to listen to you talk. It's a perfect answer. So we have a question for Steve. Does anything scare you?
Oh, yes, of course. Of course. I wouldn't be doing the sort of thing that I'm doing if things didn't scare me. I still get, I'm not afraid of the dark, but I try to make sure that my feet are covered because covers are magic and something can grab you from under the bed if your feet aren't covered. There are certain bugs. I just have an atavistic loathing for spiders. Snakes are okay. For me, spiders are not for some reason, but there are bigger things out there. I'm afraid of the state of the world. I'm afraid for my children every time that they're away, and they're all grown up now. So in a way, I shouldn't be afraid for them anymore, but I still am. And I'm afraid for my grandchildren. I'm afraid that things will go wrong in my life, in the lives of my children, and in the lives of my country. I'm very worried about my country. I'm afraid for the future in some ways. But if you ask me on a very personal level, and the thing that has come up in my fiction, I would say over the last 10 or 15 years, is I have one thing that I'm good at, and that is thinking, writing, creating, imagination. I'm afraid of losing those things. I'm afraid of Alzheimer's. I'm afraid of dementia, the slow slide. I'm afraid of I guess, getting, well, I am old. I'm afraid of getting older, I guess, because what I don't want is to come around the corner sometime and catch a conversation between my kids or my wife or somebody saying, when are we going to take away his car keys? I've given up the motorcycle. I don't do that anymore. My reflexes aren't good enough. So I've slowed down. I guess I'm worried about a diminution of talent and ability to be able to imagine, to be able to write. Those things worry me. But I worry about everything because that's sort of what I train. It's what anybody with an imagination does. You know, you're afraid the dog's going to get run over in the road. You're afraid somebody's going to fall downstairs. You're afraid of ghosts, monsters, things under the stairs. Don't ask me what I'm afraid of because the answer is everything.
Well, if it bleeds is any indication, I don't think you need to be worried anytime soon about a lessening of abilities. So anytime I interview authors, I like to end with a couple questions from the Proust questionnaire, which was made famous by Marcel Proust in the late 1880s as a way to get to know people better. I'm not going to ask any of the really, really hard questions. In fact, I'm going to limit it to one question to end on tonight before I do my thank yous and some business at the end. But the question I like to end on is, what is your idea of perfect happiness? Jim.
Oh, just feeling that maybe I've given it my best, and being aware of all of the sacrifice of my family that supported me all these 60 years. My wife and I, she's a poet, by the way, and a painter as artist, but their support of me all those years, because we had many lean years. We majored in lean years. So that's it.
How about you, Steve? Idea of perfect happiness?
Any night when I can go to bed with a satisfied mind, I'm happy.
Perfect.
That's as good as it gets, really.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think right now it's a little harder than other times to go to bed with a satisfied, or for me, a calm mind. I think that's a pretty good idea of perfect happiness. So on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our discussion. I could sit here and chat with these gentlemen all night, and I'm sure you've enjoyed it. I'd like to thank a few people for the previously submitted questions. We had questions from Brad, Ariel, Jeremy, Debbie, Fong, Robert, Mary Catherine, Tracy, Casey, Melanie, and Club Stephen King. I'd also like to extend special thanks to the incredible Erin Mitchell for masterminding this evening. And of course, thanks to both of you for your time and energy chatting with me here tonight. For more information or to order books, and as I said, we can get any of these authors' books. We also have signed book plates for A Private Cathedral. Please visit our website, murderbooks.com. And if you've enjoyed tonight's discussion, please consider buying us a cup of coffee through our virtual tip jar. Again, as it's Independent Bookstore Day, if you're not supporting us, we hope that you take a moment to support your local independent bookstore. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night.